Hello and welcome. This conversation is going to be a comparative discussion about elections. And actually, last spring I was in a conversation with Julie Donnell, who's joined us today. It's a very brief conversation, but she was telling me about a time she had spent in Paris, and we got to talking about elections, and it dawned on me they really are different from one place to another. We already know this, but it seemed like a good topic. And so several months later, as we start to close in on midterm elections here, as well as provincial elections in Quebec and national elections in Brazil, this seemed as good a time as any for us to get together to talk about these things. This discussion is being brought to you by the Department of Political Science at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, as well as College TV and the American Democracy Project. We're very happy to have you with us. The conversation is going to be in three parts, basically. We're going to spend some time talking about campaign rules or rules for campaigns. We'll talk about political parties, and then we'll also talk about the level of discourse, because Julie has an interesting story about how she realized how close she was living to the now president of France. But before we get there, I would like to introduce everyone. I've referred to her several times already. Julie Donnell is a lecturer of French as well as a lecturer of voice here at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. Joining us all the way from Washington, D.C., a proud IPFW graduate, Cheyenne Palamaju is joining us. She is the Deputy Director of Political Reform, the Political Reform Program at New America. And then finally, Michael Wolf. He is a professor at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, as well as the chair of the Department of Political Science. Thank you all very much for joining us. Julie, as I said, this began with our conversation. Why did you end up in France? What were you doing in France?
I felt like my life was static, so I decided I needed to do something. And one night I just applied to what I understood to be the best French school in the country, and I wound up accepted there. And for that reason, I got to spend a year in Paris with my husband, studying French and getting a master's degree in French literature. So that's why I was there.
And as I said, you were actually living in the same neighborhood as President Macron lives. But you didn't know that when you
we didn't know that. In fact, we only found out that Macron was there much later. We arrived in September of 2016, and we left in July of 2017, and the election was, of course, in April and May. And it became very interesting to me because the first time I encountered a political candidate in the 7th arrondissement where we lived was when François Fillon got caught paying his wife for working for him and not doing any work. So there was a big rally at the Trocadero, which was very near our home. And I got carried along by the crowd that day, and French politics started to be more interesting than they were otherwise because he was in our neighborhood. So
and you literally were on your way home and simply happened upon the rally and got caught up in it.
Right, I didn't know that. Although we did have a friend. There are several cafes, many cafes in our arrondissement. And there's one particular cafe where his political advisors met late at night. And I had a friend who would visit us and would be coming home on the metro. And of course, in Paris, everybody knows everybody else. And so he knew that it was Fillon's campaign advisors sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning worrying. So.
Yeah, very good. Cheyenne is from Brazil originally. You were born in Brazil, correct?
Yes.
What city were you born in?
São Paulo.
And is that the only city you ever lived in Brazil? I should know this, actually. I feel bad. Cheyenne was a student here. I should know these things.
That's okay. I forgive you. Yeah, pretty much São Paulo, but I have a lot of extended family in the countryside in the state of Minas Gerais. So I spent some time there too, but most of my life was in São Paulo, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, I met you at IPFW, now Purdue Fort Wayne. You were complaining about how cold it was, as I recall, and it was not cold at the time. But was that your first trip to the States when you came here for school?
Yeah, it was my first time. And I was not prepared for the cold.
And what made you come to Indiana?
Well, first of all, I was given a very generous scholarship, so that was definitely top on my list. But also, I'd grown up in Brazil. I was always interested in politics, but I was looking for an opportunity to talk about politics and to learn politics in a different context. So coming to the United States was the perfect opportunity for me to experience that through a different worldview and understand how, the global South can be different from other countries in the world, more advanced democracies, in how they think about democracy and politics in general.
When you were deciding on Fort Wayne, did it occur to you that Indiana might not be representative of the rest of the country, or were you thinking it's the Midwest, it's the best that America has to offer?
I was actually quite looking forward to coming to Indiana, mainly because São Paulo is such a cosmopolitan city, much in the same way that New York is not really representative of America. I don't think São Paulo is representative of Brazil. So coming to Fort Wayne, to me, felt like a very authentic experience to be meeting people who are, quote unquote, from real America, a term that became really, really popular in the last couple of years.
Very good. Now, Mike, you actually study comparative politics, and I used the term comparative at the start of this. How do you define that for people when they say, well, what is it you study?
Right. Well, comparative politics is really the study of other nations, for instance, and their political systems. So, comparing France to the U.S., to Russia, to South Africa, as well as other kind of democratic movements or some things elsewhere in the world. So it gives you a lens on, and I study American politics from a comparative perspective in a way to understand why American democracy is different and how it's different and what that means for democracy.
Mm-hmm. When you have a student like Cheyenne show up in class, how does that maybe shift the way you're going to do what you do when you have somebody who has experienced life in that other place?
I asked for a lot of examples. She didn't take enough of my classes, by the way. But
I knew it was coming.
Yes. So, but I really rely on them to give examples and comparisons and how things differ and why they differ, and how that comes out. But with Cheyenne, she early on, I think, recognized what democracy should be and why American democracy isn't where it should be, and where other democracies should be headed as well. So it's always healthy to have somebody with an eye on American politics that kind of give us a sense of where our shortcomings are. I mean, some of the greatest studies of American politics, Tocqueville, Lord Bryce, and others, were people coming from the outside and saying, hold on a minute, this is what's awesome about American politics, but also you have some issues, this is what's different.
Mm-hmm. And we should point out that Mike actually has traveled a fair amount and been exposed through the travels to places where you actually have studied as well. But you are also sort of a pure academic in many respects. And then we have in Julie somebody who truly just sort of stumbled into what appears to have been a very exciting election. But I quickly want to mention she is married to a former member of City Council, so she understands on a very intimate level what it's like to be running for office at the local level. And then we have in Cheyenne somebody whose job now is to, as Mike asked her beforehand, how's your research going? She does research now into democratization, into the importance of democracy. So this discussion, I hope, ends up being one part strictly academic, but also lets people understand that they're able to see these things themselves, and then maybe reach out to someone like a Cheyenne or like a Mike or John, Julie's husband, for sort of the academic side or very much the practitioner side. I hope that's part of what comes out of this. I do want to mention the day we're recording this is September 26th, and that means we are 769 days away from the next presidential election. And it's obscene that I am saying that, but at the same time, there are people who are already working in that direction. We're not even through the midterm elections yet, but we see people lining up to try and run for President of the United States. Cheyenne, Brazil's had some exciting elections, and so you're used to that, but what did you think when you came to the States and you saw how early presidential elections begin?
I think my main initial reaction was that it's just exhausting because because it really lasts so long, right? And I'd even go further to say that it never stops. It's election period all year, every year. I think the moment you get elected, you go into your office and you start calling up donors to say, okay, I'm running, 2 years from now or 4 years from now. And there's just a lot of things about that process that was surprising, and also something that I was pretty upset with, which was, if you're running all the time, it's very expensive, right? So it takes a lot of money to run a campaign, which means that if I wanted to run for office, for example, I would have a really hard time doing that because I don't have that kind of network of financial support that more established candidates have. So when campaigns don't have a start or an end date, that can be really challenging for people. And that also means that you're constantly fundraising once you get elected, which means that at the end of the day, how much of your time is being put towards legislating versus fundraising can become a really blurry line, because that without that money, you won't be able to run again. And lastly, I think that it demands a lot from the voter, because it expects that you're following politics on a constant basis. And I think that realistically, I'm a huge nerd. So yes, I will be following campaigns the moment I think they've started, but most people don't. Most people have other demands. They have jobs, they have families, and there's a reason why they rely on parties and pundits and whatnot to tell them who to vote for, because they really can't follow campaigns that closely. So yeah, one word: exhausting.
Now, Julie, when where you were in France, you were there for a decent amount of time, but they actually have limits on when the presidential campaign, the actual campaigning goes on. When did you start to notice that there was a campaign going on in terms of signs and advertisements, et cetera?
It was, well, actually, signs and advertisements are permitted. It's television advertising as we know it that is not permitted. And so, for example, the Parisian, which is a journal, only covered 12 candidates. So there were 12 candidates, and they had to have 3 characteristics. One is every presidential candidate has to have 500 signatures by other elected officials, and I'm getting to the question here. Then they have to have a substantial system of support, like Emmanuel Macron's En Marche movement, which wasn't a political party at the time, or a political party. And then they have to have started what they call a campagne de terrain, which means they have to be stumping. They have to be out stumping. So what happens is then the newspapers publish their schedules. And when they go to places, they talk about their projet, or they talk about their projects, and they lay out the way I think we know Hillary Clinton did, and I don't know if other candidates do this because I'm not really familiar with the American system, but they write out a big dossier of all the things they wish to do. So at a certain time, the agricultural dossiers of the most prominent candidates will be published, and then people can read them. And so campaigning actually starts a little bit early. The formal preparation for the election has a very short window. That starts in probably 2 or 3 weeks before the first round of elections, and France has 2 rounds of elections. So then you start to see the primary presidential candidates, the 8 or 10 primary presidential candidates, and I don't mean primary as in primary.
Or version. The main candidates.
The main candidates. Mm-hmm. You'll see their pictures, and they all have a similar poster. It's long enough for people to draw mustaches on them.
Well,
but it's a very short window. So yeah.
And really, that time period when the dossiers are being published, what you're actually talking about are somewhat meaty policy statements?
These are meaty policy statements, and when there's a debate in France about these policy statements, it's a long debate, and it's based on the dossiers. It's not just a 3-minute soundbite type of thing.
And Cheyenne, when you said it's exhausting, for you, it's really about the campaign part of it. If there were meaty discussions about policies, would you say you were a geek or a nerd? I can't remember which you said. For you, the having something substantive to read would actually be a good thing, right?
It would be, yes. I think that if you if you're giving the voter a reason for her to stay, focused and up to date with what's happening, I think then it makes more sense for them when they see a campaign that lasts, a year or 2 years. I think the problem with campaigns here in the US is that there's no clear agenda or sets of actions that must occur from time to time that sort of mark times within that period that the voter will say, okay, now it's time to read those platforms. Okay, now it's time to figure out, who my top 3 candidates are. And I think that's part of the challenge, definitely.
Now, Mike, as I recall, it was Bill Clinton who started the permanent campaign. But realistically, there were people doing things he decided to formalize. What sort of activities do candidates do that are really kind of campaigning, even if they're not in a period when they're campaigning?
Yeah. Well, we'll see a bunch of politicians from California and elsewhere spending time in Iowa and New Hampshire, more than they're probably spending time in Washington or California. It's a bizarre system in that sense, and it does begin early. It's strange. It's a product of history, a product of the agricultural age. When Congress decided to increase voting, they would have it in the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November when the crop is in. And then we've just added to this with making primary elections or nomination phases. Before 1972, the parties kind of chose their candidate in smoke-filled rooms at the convention. Democrats changed the rules, and now that opened up then this season in the winter that was kind of just fallow, and the local parties choosing their local candidates. But so we've time-wise built a 1800s model, added candidates in technology, and really then filled a very strange calendar. And her point about exhausting, in 2016, in June of 2016, 60% of the American electorate said that they were already exhausted by the 2016, 5 months before the election, right? So the Cheyenne was in good company. So.
It's exhausting for voters, but it's not like it's easy for the candidates. I mean, the candidates have a fair amount of work to do here, and as Cheyenne pointed out, this is not inexpensive. Even if we limited it to a window, the idea that you would be able to campaign in the states to 300 million plus people, that would take significant resources. And so there's some logic to having a window that's maybe a little larger than what we see in terms of, for example, Quebec provincial elections are going on right now. There's a fairly tight window. What we see in France and Brazil, there are some windows to what happens there. Do we actually benefit by not having limits on when our campaigning takes place? Cheyenne, I'll start with you.
I don't know if we benefit. I think that's hard to know. I think that one potential benefit would be that if maybe you're a candidate that doesn't have that kind of financial network, and that it will take you a long time to build those connections and to be able to raise a certain amount of money that would make your candidacy viable, then sure, if you can start your campaign 5 years before you decide running for office. Apart from that, I think it's hard to think of any other reason why that's beneficial, especially both for the electorate, but also for the candidates themselves.
But do we have some First Amendment issues here? I mean, how do we balance this idea that I'm allowed to say what I want, especially in an era of, say, Citizens United? I can say what I want, but you're going to limit me in when I can engage in campaign activity? That seems to be a very difficult set of circumstances to try and deal with.
Certainly, and I mean, the upside is we know these people by the time the election comes, and the downside certainly, again, you're having politicians not doing their day jobs, purposely not doing their day jobs, and running for election. It has another positive, just to throw it in, is we've had some outsiders that most likely wouldn't have been nominated by their party in the old kind of party. Even Ronald Reagan, definitely Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter. These are people that wouldn't have been President of the United States had it not been for this kind of open, long season where they could kind of get rolled out and introduced to the American public.
Mm-hmm. Julie, you mentioned already the 2 rounds in France. Explain to those who don't know the amount of time between the 2 of them, and then a little more specifically, here we're very familiar with candidates needing to run out to the extremes to get their nominations, and then they run back toward the middle to secure the majority of votes. There's not time for that really in the French system.
And in fact, because I was thinking about that question earlier today, because of the fact that one has to put one's dossier forward, there's not really the opportunity to move too far left or right to get to the center. So the first round happens in the end of April, and on a Sunday. Voting is on a Sunday so that everyone can attend, and France has a far higher success rate of voter attendance than we do in the United States. And then 2 weeks later is the final round. So you have 6 to 8 candidates, let's say for the presidential election. They're voted up or down. The 2 that had the highest percentages of votes then go to the second round. So there's not any time for them. They have to solidify themselves and present themselves in the best possible manner to the public. So that's what happens. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating.
Cheyenne, Brazil has a runoff as well. How many weeks between the first and second round?
So first round, October 7th, second round, October 28th.
And how do you see candidates running one direction and then another after they see who the finalists are, or how does it work there?
It's possible to make some tweaks. I think mainly because, one, we have, last time I checked, this changes all the time, but last time I checked, we have 32 political parties in Brazil registered. That number fluctuates by, a couple here and there. 5 of them are really the ones that control government, but candidates are able to shift their positions a little bit after the first round because they have to be looking for these coalitions. And I think that voters are usually not surprised when they see that happening. Voters in Brazil, I think very much like voters in most places, are pretty jaded, and it takes a lot to surprise a voter in Brazil. So seeing a candidate who promises X, but then once he or she, goes through the first round, ends up changing that platform to Y is not really a huge surprise.
And in this case, we're not talking about going after that median voter that we see in the United States. Here it's, I believe that I have 40% of the vote. I need 50%. Which coalition do I want to try and form? So I'm going to say something that appeals to this party or that party.
Precisely,
yeah.
Yes.
Now, Mike, I think there are a lot of people who would not mind if the U.S. went to a similar sort of arrangement because of what appears to be an advantage about not running out to the extremes and then running back, but also tightening up that window. What do we know about runoff elections? Do we see benefits? Do we know if there are benefits?
All the time in these type of systems, the electoral systems in democracies try to provide representation to different sectors of society, but also some governing stability. And those things don't go together. And so usually with a runoff system, in this case, you have 5 or a half dozen to 12 parties in these major democracies that can compete in the first round, that can put positions out, that can be against the status quo generally. And so it allows for representation, allows for people that they say vote for your heart the first round and then your head the second round. But that second round provides the stability and the governing stability in these places where you have a pretty firm answer with a majority vote for sure in the second round of who the winner is. So it provides both some representation and some stability.
the U.S. really has basically two major political parties, all respect intended to the different groups who are also out there, libertarians, Greens, et cetera. Why have we ended up with only two in the United States?
Well, part is our rules that directly favor the old argument, Duverger's law, that somebody realizes pretty quickly where if they support a third party, that they're not likely to win, and so maybe their preference switches is to support their second favorite party or vote against their worst favorite party. And there's also a political culture element that the United States, compared to France and compared to other democracies, doesn't have the left due to the American historical tradition. The socialist movement didn't hit here for numerous reasons. And so we've lacked really even conservative politics in these European democracies are to the left of us in many ways. And then you have the socialist or social democratic parties, which are very far to the left. We also don't have nationalist parties either. So we're pretty tight just by our American political belief systems anyway. So our parties are they're more like liberal parties in those democracies, which, while important, are probably third or fourth parties, I would say, wouldn't you? Probably. So,
Julia, how easily could you distinguish, especially as somebody from the outside, how easily could you distinguish between whether it was even just the two finalists versus the 6 or the dozen before that? I mean, could you, when someone said a party, could you say, oh, I know exactly where they stand after reading a couple of newspaper articles, or was it kind of confusing for you?
For me, it was not so confusing because I had taken a political science class about French politics before I left, and so I kind of understood. But you can watch television and find out, and people generally know in France that Emmanuel Macron worked for François Hollande, and you know these things. So you kind of, they're like, France is much smaller than the United States, and people are not coming up from the known candidates are pretty well known across the board. Just as anecdotally, the way I found things out was I would take taxi rides and ask the taxi drivers who they were voting for. And it was very fun to hear what the different, you could almost predict where they were. And then you would find out as you get more familiar with Paris, you will learn that certain arrondissements, certain neighborhoods are going to be conservative, certain neighborhoods are going to be more liberal, certain neighborhoods are going to be more center. And that's kind of a known thing as well.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned Macron, who basically started his own political party for this one election. So there's a movement that we would almost never see here.
There's a possible creativity, and it's interesting. I was just reading today that several French political parties are actually coalitions of smaller parties that have become coalesced. So that can work, and so you take a certain part of that and a certain part of that, and because French society with the populist movement is shifting so quickly, you'll have people changing parties. So right now, my political science professor was absolutely amazed at the fact that very far left people and very far right people were coming together to vote for Marine Le Pen. And he was studying the reasons for that. And of course, it's economic, but that's kind of, it fluctuates in France. And I would say, first of all, En Marche is now a political party, but when it started, it was what he called a movement. Right. And now I think it's a formal political party. Maybe you know more about that than I do. But that was kind of this upswell, this discontent with the two major central left party and right party. They wanted to find something a little bit more coalesced. Mm-hmm.
Cheyenne, 32 parties down to 2. When you got here, what did you think?
When I first came here, I thought that was great. I felt that I had a solid grasp on, okay, what each party stands for, and, you know, am I a conservative? Am I progressive, liberal, libertarian? That was really reassuring. You know, I came here on a student visa, wasn't able to vote or anything, but I was really excited about the idea of, you know, if I were a voter here, I would definitely want to vote because I know exactly what these parties stand for. So that initially was pretty exciting. I think that over the last few years, it's shown that the two-party system isn't holding anymore. I think that there's a lot of people who don't feel that either party represents them, but because you don't have another option, you have to either vote for the party that you think, comes the closest to representing you, or, pretty much voting against the other party, like you mentioned. But I do think that there's probably a sweet spot between 2 and 32.
31, maybe 30. Who knows?
Yeah.
Do either of you sitting here with me? Do you think that we would benefit from having a viable third party?
Julie?
I would like to see that happen. I would like to see a viable third party. I think the polarization in the United States right now is such that we need to find some solution, and that might be a way to do it. I think part of the issue has to do with campaign finance reform. If we could get campaign finance reform working for us, maybe we would see the two parties come together a little bit more. So that's part of it. Mike?
Yeah, and usually we see third parties manifested in presidential elections, but Theodore Lowy, a political scientist, said, where we should really see them emerge is in Congress, because they would maybe be able to break through on some of these big issues and kind of triangulate some issues and take away some of this deadlock. And so we often see them pop up in the wrong place, that maybe it would be the legislative branch where they would do the most good. But getting them there is the hard part.
Obviously, we've had a couple people bring up campaign finance issues here, either the amount of money that has to be raised or the influence of it. Mike, what other sort of institutional changes might take place that would make it a little more viable for a third party to get elected, even to a city council, let alone to the U.S. House of Representatives?
Well, campaign finance is a hard thing to change now because of the Supreme Court decisions. So it would be hard to imagine. Self-financing obviously helps. Donald Trump is kind of the example where you can get around some of the more formalized components of it. And that's not always favorable to everybody. So I don't, sometimes the power of ideas break through. Sometimes, it's just, we see a politician who wasn't a member of the two major parties in France, for instance, break through and become president when the two existing parties were kind of so negatively seen, right? So you can never kind of give up on a potentially pregnant moment for a breakthrough.
And as Cheyenne pointed out, and Julie as well, the polarization of what's happening right now, there are a lot of people who think that the parties are not particularly effective in this moment, which suggests, oh, maybe this is the time that third party is going to break through. But the reality is the rules are such that it's a little difficult to get traction. Julie mentioned needing 500 signatures to be, as one of the steps to being a viable candidate for president in France. In Indiana, to be a candidate for governor, you need 3 or 4 times that, and that's just to be a third-party, non-major party candidate. So we have barriers here that are going to keep this from happening, I think, anytime too quickly. Would a proportional system work a little bit better, perhaps, Mike? A proportional representation system?
I mean, we've talked about this considerably, and the benefits of that would be the potential introduction of another party. The downside is, though, is the notion of what we talked about with stability, that when you open and change the system, especially with the institutions we have, you might not end up with the coalition or something that you would need to really provide. And our system is somewhat unstable anyway with the checks and balances. So the real question is, would that provide a legitimate alternative in our institutional system?
Yeah, the minority coalitions, when you have to get together those 2 or 3 groups to create a government, that does become kind of shaky because you've compromised on something at that moment, and that may be sort of the big concern. Cheyenne, what do you think?
I think it would work. I think part of the challenge would be figuring out what a strong, viable third party would actually stand for. There is a study that one of my colleagues here, Lee Drutman, put it out recently on whether or not Americans want a third party. And 2/3 of Americans do seem to say, yes, a third party is a great idea. But they don't quite know what that third party would be. And I think that because of that, you open up, like Professor Wolf mentioned, the possibility for a lot of instability. When you open up for more parties, you're open up the risk for more extreme parties, more extreme candidates who could potentially end up in office. So that's dangerous, but it would also increase the number of ethnic minorities that are represented. It could potentially decrease the incentives for gerrymandering, right? Because then you could hopefully feel that the candidate that you're voting for is more representative of your community. So it's a trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, you've done some research on political discussion. It's always interesting when Mike's doing the research, especially if he has recordings of the respondents to his polls, because the responses are interesting to say the least. Does the negative tone of what we're seeing right now energize particular voters, or is it really just turning everyone off?
No, it does energize some people. It energizes hardcore partisans. And for some of the reasons we've been talking about, what we're seeing in a lot of democracies is mobilization by negative tones. And in the American system, we look over 40 years, and even the strongest partisans like their party less than they did 40 years ago. So they aren't getting as mobilized by true love of their party and the party's positions. They are more and more mobilized by their hatred of the other party. And so that means that some of the negativity, some of the really tough stuff does mobilize some people. Now, it demobilizes others, so it's not a simple on-off switch. It does both. And so it's not a surprise that you kind of have this strange effect where some moderates in the middle and others are kind of turned off by the tone, but that really gets people jacked up to go out to vote that are strong partisans. And we have more of them. This is the irony of it, is that with more education and with more media, we've given people a lot of good reasons to vote against somebody and the kind of cognitive power to do that. So as a result, the unintended consequence is that negativity is on the rise.
And there's kind of a reality for political campaigns that if you can win the election with a small electorate, you're not encouraged to expand the electorate. So if negative tones turn off some voters but energize yours, in some respects you're almost encouraged to do it from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, and we know this because no one knows how to approach the millennials and ask them to vote, and so they get ignored. And we go out and continue to knock on doors and knock around the other side, as a way to win elections.
Julie, did you see much of this in France? Did you see that? Did you sense, read, feel that negative tone that some people say is happening here?
I did not. It was pretty much intellectual. The negative tone came in. In one debate, perhaps, when Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen were facing off. And in this particular debate, they were sitting across from one another at a desk with a moderator, but they had 20 or 30 minutes to say whatever they had to say. It was sort of like the Lincoln Douglas debates.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like that, only sitting across. It was very funny. And Marine Le Pen was trying really hard to insult Emmanuel Macron, and he was like Teflon at that time. Now what's happening, from the little I'm following of French journalism right now, is Macron is no longer popular. And he was a golden boy for 18 months, and now he's no longer popular. So we're starting to see negative things come up that almost seem American-style negative from when I look at them, and that I think is, I think the political tone is being taken in the context of what happened in the American election. May I say that? I mean, it's just there was a context when I went over there.
Sure.
There was Brexit.
Yep.
There was then Donald Trump being elected. In that context, France sits in that crucible.
And there were other elections going on in Europe where similar dynamics were sort of playing out as well. Cheyenne, how about down in Brazil? Do you get the sort of negativity that we see here?
Yes, definitely. These are very challenging times back home. I think that, you know, I have certainly not experienced this kind of political moment in my lifetime before. And, you know, you have a country that went through probably one of the world's largest political scandals. It put nearly the entire political class in jail. We had one of the worst recessions in the last 30 years. And yeah, of course, you have this movement, this populist movement around the world that definitely fueled a lot of the rhetoric in Brazil. So we're definitely seeing that, particularly with Jair Bolsonaro, who's the front runner in the presidential election. His speech was very vicious. He was very aggressive. And as he became more popular, I think he got some very good political consultants to tell him to tone it down. So it's gotten a little bit better. And, you know, now he's appealing to more people. But definitely there's a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment in Brazilians in seeing their country go from, you know, being this South American giant with a lot of potential and just being gutted by the political class. So this sort of anti-establishment movement, this populist wave that is saying what we need is order, what we need is, you know, to put bandits in jail, what we need is to, you know, give citizens guns so they can defend themselves. That is a very violent-oriented kind of rhetoric, but because of the particular political environment, that's a rhetoric that's catching on, definitely.
I think it was last week, it might have been 2 weeks ago, I was listening to a news report about debates in Quebec, and the moderator was actually being criticized for holding the candidates in check, which I found an interesting approach, because here, you know, when we don't hold them in check is when we criticize. What is debate like? You mentioned 20 to 30 minutes, and I'm guessing during that time period it was okay to poke each other, even though it wasn't your turn. Yeah.
They spoke from their prepared, there would be a sentence or a question would be asked, and then one would respond 10 or 15 minutes and back and forth, and they just talked, and the moderator sat there. And it was nice because you could really hear them talk, you could see their personalities, and Marine Le Pen had had a very close chance of winning the election. And I think my husband and I are of the opinion that it was that vituperative attitude that she put forward, as well as she had notes all across her desk, and she was kind of trying to find her place, and Macron had nothing. He was just there, and was able to speak extemporaneously, which is how French politicians are trained. So it was just hands down he won that.
The visual man.
That visual thing. I would say one other thing. I just thought of something. When you talk about negativity, there may have been negativity that I did not see, but because there were no television ads or radio ads, that kind of nasty stuff couldn't be put up. Does that make sense?
Sure.
But there have been serious scandals that have affected French politics. So Dominique Strauss-Kahn, that's how François Hollande got elected, and then you have François Fillon, and that's really what elevated Emmanuel Macron into the position that he was in. So the negativity has to do with the scandal, with the corruption. That was my outsider's take on that.
Cheyenne, what do they do debates? Will you put 32 people on a stage for a debate down?
We haven't had a 32-person debate yet. I wouldn't be surprised if that eventually happens. No, I think the last debate we had maybe 10 or 12 of the the presidential candidates, and it's very similar to the model here in the U.S. You know, very very quick. You only get 2 minutes. Really trying to give everybody an opportunity to answer the question. And at the end of the debate, you have no idea what you just watched.
Is it okay to interrupt during it? If you're answering a question, can I interrupt you during these debates, or is that frowned upon?
It's sure it's against the rules, but I mean, rules usually go out the window during those debates. I don't think they've gotten particularly vile. They might, once we get a little bit closer, you know, we're, I think last time I checked, two or 3 weeks away. So I know we have at least one more debate before the first round. So that might happen. But yeah, you can interrupt, and you know that's your chance to shine, because you really have to stand out, right? So you're gonna say something outrageous, or you're gonna say something funny, or you're gonna say, you know, God wants me to be new president, something that will make voters remember you. So very different from France.
After the debates, what's discussion like among voters?
I think that most of the time, the discussion is very similar to what I just said. This kind of inability to tell things apart and to figure out what each candidate stands for. A lot of the time, it's very similar to how the comment goes here in the U.S. You know, the sort of who won the debate. That's always a big question. But the conversation doesn't necessarily go towards a discussion of whether or not, you know, this debate made me feel more willing or less willing to vote for a certain candidate. So the debates are more of a show than an opportunity for candidates to discuss their platforms.
We're all shocked to hear that they're theater. You're killing us here with that sort of stuff.
I know.
Yeah. Outside of debate time, what is political discourse like? We'll just stay with Cheyenne for right now. What's political discourse like? If we go into a restaurant, if we go to into a coffee shop, what are we going to hear from people?
I think that, you know, these are very interesting times in Brazilian politics. While on one side there is a lot of division, there is a lot of polarization, there is a lot of hate, and I don't want to undermine that. I think it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous that, you know, right now 28% of Brazilians intend to vote for an authoritarian, pro-military candidate. So I don't want to downplay that. But at the same time, it's really inspiring and exciting to see people having these conversations. People don't usually talk about politics in Brazil in terms of substance. You know, it's all very abstract in the sense of politicians are corrupt, or, you know, nothing works. Whereas now, because the stakes seem really high, there is a much more nuanced conversation around platforms. A lot of the times it's mostly saying you do not want to vote for candidate X because candidate X is proposing these policies, as opposed to saying this other candidate would do the opposite. But I think just the fact that people are feeling mobilized to talk and to act against specific policies, as opposed to, you know, I don't like this candidate, I think that's something to be celebrated. So I'm trying to be an optimist here.
Julie, the debates sound incredibly civil and high-minded in France. They sound that way. What's discourse like? We go into a cafe, what are we going to hear? You mentioned you talked to the taxi drivers. What?
I think the discourse depends on which neighborhood you're in. People tend to gather in like-minded groups, and I did not penetrate French culture to that degree to be able to do that. My friend was a socialist, and so and I think he voted Macron. So I'm not really sure I can speak to that, except to say I know that in the arrondissement where I lived, François Fillon had his very strong supporters, as did Macron. Mm-hmm. So I wish I could tell you more, but I can't.
Mike, how would you describe discourse here right now in the U.S.?
Well, it's not healthy, you know. We have recurring huge public policy debates, but we're not debating them, nor are we really looking for reasonable policies on them. So we continue to kind of, you know, attack each other, and so I don't think that's a very fruitful place that we're at in this environment. Midterm elections are never really, they're usually negative toward the incumbent party. That's to be expected. We've seen this with all, you know, with Barack Obama, George W. Bush, everybody before that. So it's particularly right now probably a point where there's a little consensus on hardly anything. We've you know, really added partisan elements to foreign policy that hadn't been there in a long time. That just adds to layers of kind of ability to dislike the other side. So, good times.
Cheyenne, you said that quite often the discourse is about the negative. Don't vote for so-and-so because they want to do this bad thing, which is not necessarily optimistic or positive discourse. Do you think having multiple political parties makes it easier for people to discuss issues or to raise the level of discussion?
No, it doesn't. And I want to emphasize that people in Brazil very rarely think about in terms of political parties when they are talking about candidates. Campaigns and elections in Brazil are very personality driven. Apart from the Workers' Party, I think the opposition and the party itself, you know, they did a pretty good job of attaching, you know, corruption to the label of the party. So it's one of the very few parties that is very well recognized, that either incites very positive or negative feelings in voters. But apart from that, the parties don't necessarily help that discussion, because if you asked 99% of people in Brazil, you know, with which party would you associate policy X, they wouldn't be able to do that. And that's not because voters are misinformed. It's because it's nearly impossible to do it. So that doesn't help. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because campaigns are very personality driven. So as long as you're able to make a strong case, you know, whatever party label that you have next to your name really won't make that big of a difference when it comes to whether or not people vote for you.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to give everyone a chance to say what they think might help to improve the level of discourse here in the States, most specifically, but generally, I think it's safe to comment on it generally as well. And we'll start with you, Julie. What do you think would help improve the discourse?
I think candidates need to be more they need to give a more in-depth idea of what they plan to do or what they see as best for be it the city or the nation. I think they need to be more in depth and more concrete about their potential policies. And I think the American voter needs to remember that we are Americans. And I don't want to call it a nationalistic thing, but it's a patriotic thing. You need to understand what the candidates are saying and do a little bit of research. And somehow the media has to make it easier for us to find that information, because it's lack of information, it's lack of understanding, and that's why when I talk about the taxi drivers, many times they're far more informed than, say, people I know here in Fort Wayne about local politics. They're far more informed about French politics.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
I mean, there's long-term, medium-term, and short-term things. The long-term is, you know, we need to get back to educating people on politics, government. We've moved away from it. I think there's a year and a half on average less education at the high school level than there used to be. And we can see that the contextualized parts of American politics then are lost. People don't understand it, much less, by the way, understand the rest of the world. And so the long term that. And medium term, it's going to take one of these parties completely crashing and a realigning of the American party system.
Which we should point out has happened before.
It has happened. Yeah. They are not comfortable moments, to be sure. but that's how it is. And then in the short term, you know, it is a communication issue. It is, you know, talking to people that you wouldn't normally talk to about politics, whether it's a taxi driver, your neighbor, or somebody, and at the individual level, really kind of reinvigorating the notion that it's okay to disagree with somebody about politics and not think that that they're the devil. You know, we need to rebuild trust, interpersonal trust between people.
Cheyenne, I'm afraid you only get about 30 seconds.
I will say everything that they said, plus I think party leadership. I think that, you know, there is a lack of a unified vision for what is civil behavior on both sides, right? So that sort of conversation about here's what we stand for and here's what's not okay and here's how we conduct the debate. I think that's important. I think that a lot of the times the parties get a little lost in the heat of the moment in fighting the battles that they believe are very important battles. And during those moments, sort of all bets are off, and that's when you get really ugly discourse.
And that was Cheyenne Polamaju out in Washington, D.C. with New America. She is Deputy Director of Political Reform Program. Thank you very much for joining us, Cheyenne.
Thank you for having me.
Sitting at the end of the row here is Mike Wolf, a professor of political science here at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, also chair of the Department of Political Science. And then next to me, Julie Donnell, who spent what sounds like a wonderful time in France, but also a lecturer in French and in voice here at PFW. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to thank College TV for broadcasting this, as well as WBOI. And I want to thank the Departments of Political Science and the American Democracy Project for sponsoring it. Thank you very much for joining us.